Okay, here we go then. Let's dive into this stack of sources you've pulled together for us.
Sounds good.
Today, we're tackling something, well, pretty significant. The latest on those high-level trade talks, U.S. and China.
Right. And the material we have, it's mostly analysis, some commentary from like a news discussion covering the recent talks in London.
And there was a big announcement too, wasn't there?
Right at the end.
Exactly. That's a key piece.
Yeah.
So our mission today, using this material, is really to unpack, what success are they actually signaling here? Mm-hmm. What might they have actually agreed on based on the details we have? And crucially, what big questions does this source material throw up once you dig in a bit?
Yeah, getting past the sort of headline and into the nitty-gritty that makes you go,
Precisely.
Okay, so let's start where the source does, the signals coming out of London, right?
Yeah.
If China will course correct by upholding its end of the initial trade agreement we outlined in Geneva, and I believe after our talks in London they will, then the rebalancing of the world's two largest economies is possible.
So reports cited in our source materials say both the U.S. and China were kind of signaling success after those 2 days of talks.
Success. How? What did they say? Well, the indication was they'd agreed on a framework for moving forward. That's the phrase used.
A framework. Okay. And the process. What happens next, according to the source?
So the delegations were apparently heading back, briefing their presidents, Xi and Trump, on the details.
Right.
And the actual implementation, putting things into action, that was waiting on the final approvals from the very top.
So groundwork laid, maybe a path agreed.
Yeah.
But needed that final presidential sign-off.
That's the picture painted, yeah.
Right.
Which leads us right into that announcement you mentioned.
The Truth Social post from President Trump, it landed just as the talks were wrapping up.
It did. And this is really where the source analysis zooms in. Trump toasts, declaring the deal with China is done.
Done. Wow.
Well, he did add subject to those final approvals. But yeah, done. And then he gave some specifics.
Okay, well, what did he say was in this done deal?
He got quite specific.
Yep.
Said China will supply full magnets and any necessary rare earths up front. That upfront seems key.
Magnets and rare earths.
Yeah.
Got it. Those critical minerals we always talk about.
Exactly. Essential stuff. And in return, the U.S. provides, agreed to items. He specifically mentioned Chinese students using our colleges and universities.
Interesting. Students.
Yeah. And he added a comment saying that student part has always been good with him.
Okay, so rare earths from China, students going to the U.S. What about tariffs? That's always huge in these talks.
He hit that too. Gave specific numbers, said the U.S. is getting a total of 55% tariffs, while China gets 10%.
Whoa, 55%. Okay, we'll come back to that number, I'm sure.
Definitely. And he finished by saying the relationship was excellent.
So a very clear, very positive statement from the president himself.
Yeah.
Does the source discussion confirm that this aligns with the London talks focus?
It does, yeah. The analysis confirms the main focus was squarely on getting China's rare earths flowing reliably to the U.S.
And the quid pro quo, the U.S. side of the bargain.
The expectation, based on the source discussion, is that U.S. export restrictions should ease up. Those controls on what U.S. tech can be sold to China.
Sensitive tech, usually.
Yeah.
Things with national security implications, potentially.
Right. And the source brings in Howard Lutnick's view here.
Ah, okay. What did he say?
Well, Lutnick's quoted expecting this whole rare earth minerals and magnets issue to be resolved within this implementation framework.
Okay.
And he also expects the U.S. measures, the restrictions put on when rare earths weren't coming through, he expects those to come off.
Come off.
So in a balanced way, he says, once the licenses for the rare earth shipments are approved, he directly links that to U.S. export controls coming down.
So the core deal sounds like rare earths start flowing in, some U.S. export restrictions start coming off. Seems straightforward, maybe.
Well, yeah, on the surface.
Yeah.
But then the source discussion starts to characterize the nature of this step.
How so?
They call it a positive step in the right direction, which sounds good, but they immediately add it's a somewhat small one.
Okay, so positive, but small. And they compare it to previous talks.
They do. Specifically after Geneva, they say this basically just gets things back to where they were around that point.
Ah, right. And I remember the issue after Geneva, the source reminds us, was the U.S. feeling that China was slow-walking the deal.
Exactly. Delaying, dragging their feet, because there wasn't a clear timeline they had to stick to.
Which leads to the obvious question, right? Highlighted in the source.
The crucial question. Is there a timeline this time? a deadline. And, how quickly, how fully will both sides actually follow through? A framework's one thing.
Getting the minerals shipped and the controls lifted is another?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is where the source material really gets interesting because it starts drilling down into the specifics from Trump's post, asking some sharp questions.
Okay, let's unpack those. What's the first one they raise?
The Chinese students comment. Remember, Trump said allowing them in U.S. colleges was always been good with him. But the source commentators immediately jump on that. They point to a very recent proclamation, a policy that specifically restricted foreign student visas.
Restricted them.
For who? For students with certain affiliations, and it specifically mentioned institutions like Harvard.
Harvard specifically. Wow. So how does always been good with him swear with a policy restricting students at Harvard?
Exactly. That's the question. The source flags. Seems like a potential contradiction right there. What else?
What else did they focus on from the president's post?
Semiconductors. Now, rare earths were the main focus of the talks in the post.
Right.
But semiconductors, microchips, they get mentioned in the source's broader discussion about China and U.S. export controls. It's a huge area.
And the source notes that Trump's post didn't mention semiconductors.
Correct. Not a word about them in that specific deal is done post. But the expectation discussed in the source, based on how these things usually work, reciprocal easing, the expectation is that restrictions on things like jet engines, chip software companies,
the kind of stuff that's really been biting.
Exactly. Those restrictions should ease up. But, and this is important, it's presented as conditional.
Conditional on what?
Conditional on the rare earths actually starting to flow from China.
I see. So it's not explicitly in the announcement, but it's the presumed other side of the coin for getting the rare earths, expected, but maybe not guaranteed in writing in that post.
That seems to be the analysis, yes. It implied, heavily expected, but not spelled out there.
Okay. And what's the third big specific they questioned from the post?
The tariff numbers. This one really stood out in the source discussion. Trump said the U.S. is getting a total of 55% tariffs, China getting 10%.
Yeah, that 55% sounded high. What did the source say?
The commentators immediately questioned it. They pointed out that the previous level, the established rate on many Chinese goods, was around 30%.
30, not 55. That's a big jump.
A huge jump. So the question is, where does this 55% number come from? The source explicitly says this raises more questions, more to dig into. It's just not clear.
Right, because a jump like that, 25 points, that would normally be a massive policy shift in trade talks. Needs explanation.
Absolutely. It's not just a minor tweak.
Okay, so let's try and connect these threads. We have the president saying deal is done, specifics given, rare earths, students, these tariff numbers.
Yep.
But the source material, looking closely, says, hold on. Raises questions about contradictions, like the student policy versus the comment.
Right.
Raises questions about significant omissions, like semiconductors not being mentioned when they're key to export controls. And raises questions about, frankly, puzzling figures like that 55% tariff number. Where did that come from?
Exactly. The analysis shows that, maybe there's a high-level framework, maybe it's announced as done, but the details, they seem to contain ambiguities, inconsistencies, maybe even errors or at least unexplained numbers.
And stepping back a bit, the source discussion also puts this whole thing in a wider context, doesn't it?
It does. They frame it as, look, this specific step might be small, and ultimately these are just incremental moves.
Incremental steps in a much, much bigger picture.
Yeah, the long-term, incredibly complex U.S. China relationship, which covers trade, sure, but also security, tech competition, global influence, everything.
And the view in the source is that this isn't ending anytime soon, this negotiation process.
No, the sense is this will likely go on way past the current administration. It's seen as just part of this long, ongoing dynamic between the two powers.
Okay, so let's recap this deep dive then, based on these sources. What we have is a high-level framework agreement announced by the president as done.
Right. Focused on rare earths going to the U.S. and in return, some easing of U.S. export controls.
But digging into the source analysis of that announcement reveals, well, a lot of complexity. Lingering questions.
Yeah, the implementation seems conditional. It's a framework, not flicking a switch. There are apparent contradictions, like the student Harvard issue.
Lack of clarity on key related items like semiconductors in the actual announcement.
And those unexplained figures, especially the 55% tariff number.
And all this is happening, as the source points out, within this much longer game, this incremental, ongoing relationship negotiation.
Precisely. It's a step, maybe positive, as they say, but one that seems to raise almost as many questions as it answers when you look closely at the specifics provided.
Which leaves you, the listener, with something to chew on, maybe.
Yeah.
Considering these details and the pretty significant questions the sources raise about who gets visas, what the actual tariff rates are, what does it really mean when a trade deal like this is called done? How much is truly settled in these kinds of incremental steps?